Azure API Management for Fintech Startups, 5 Design Patterns. Azure API Management for Fintech Startups, 5 Design Patterns. That's what we're tackling today. If you've been wondering about Azure API Management for Fintech Startups, stick around. Next up, now, why Azure API Management makes sense for Fintech Startups. The honest case for Azure API Management is not that it is the cheapest option or the easiest to set up. It is that it collapses 4 separate concerns into one managed service: authentication, rate limiting, analytics, and a developer portal. A startup building payment APIs would otherwise need to stitch those capabilities together from scratch or buy separate SaaS tools for each one. APIM sits between your clients and your backend services. Every inbound request passes through a policy pipeline where you can inspect, transform, throttle, or reject it before it reaches your code. This matters for fintech specifically because payment APIs carry liability. A poorly configured endpoint that leaks transaction data or allows unauthenticated calls is not just a technical problem. Microsoft's Azure API Management documentation outlines the full policy catalog, but the key point for startups is integration depth. Azure API Management connects directly to Azure Active Directory B2C, which is relevant if you are already building customer-facing apps. If you have walked through a Flutter and Azure B2C customer onboarding flow, you already have the identity layer that APIM can consume for API authorization without duplicating infrastructure. Next up, Pattern 1, Secure Payment API Gateway with OAuth 2.0 and Mutual TLS. The pattern, route all payment API traffic through Azure API Management with OAuth 2.0 bearer token validation at the gateway layer and Mutual TLS for backend connections. This is the baseline security pattern every fintech startup should have in place before going live. Here is how it works in practice. The policy is where most teams make their first mistake. The default configuration only verifies the token's signature, not the audience or issuer claims. A misconfigured JWT validator will accept tokens issued for a completely different application. Always pin the issuer URL and expected audience explicitly. Next up, moving on to Pattern 2, Rate Limiting and Throttling for Payment APIs on Azure. The pattern, apply layered rate limits using Azure API Management's policy to protect both your backend and your operating costs. Rate limiting in APIM works at 2 levels. The first is a global rate limit that protects your backend from traffic spikes. The second is a per-subscription or per-IP limit that prevents any single consumer from monopolizing your API capacity. A typical setup for a startup payment API. Let's talk about next up, Pattern 3, PCI DSS compliant API design on Azure. The pattern, structure your Azure API management policies and network configuration to satisfy PCI DSS requirements without building a custom compliance layer from scratch. PCI DSS compliance for payment APIs is not a single setting you flip on. It is a set of architectural constraints that affect your APIM deployment, your network topology, and your logging configuration. The PCI Security Standards Council publishes the full requirements, but the APIM-specific considerations break down as follows. Network isolation, deploy Azure API Management in a virtual network with internal mode. This means the gateway is not publicly accessible by default. You front it with an Azure Application Gateway or Azure Front Door for the public endpoint, giving you WAF protection before traffic even reaches APIM. Now, next up, Pattern 4, Monetizable API Architecture for Fintech Products. The pattern, use Azure API Management's products and subscriptions model to create tiered API access that maps directly to your pricing plans. This is the pattern that rarely gets coverage for startups, probably because most API management tutorials assume internal-only APIs. But if your fintech product includes an API layer that partners or third-party developers can access, then APIM's product model is your monetization infrastructure. Here is how the model works in Azure API Management. Now, Pattern 5, API versioning without breaking existing integrations. The pattern, use Azure API Management's built-in versioning and revision system to ship API changes without disrupting existing consumers. API versioning gets messy fast when you are moving quickly. Azure API Management handles this with 2 separate concepts that are easy to conflate. Revisions are non-breaking changes to an existing API version. You can add a new operation, modify a policy, or fix a bug in a revision without creating a new version number. Revisions can be tested in isolation and then promoted to current without changing the URL consumers call. Now, let's talk about Azure API Management pricing, what startups actually pay. Azure API Management for fintech startups consistently runs into the same early question: can we afford the tier that supports VNet injection and the custom policies we need for compliance? The short answer is that the developer tier works fine for non-production environments but does not support VNet integration, which PCI DSS effectively requires. The basic tier adds SLA coverage but still lacks VNet. The standard tier is where full network isolation becomes available. Most startups end up on standard once they are handling real payment traffic. That is a meaningful line item for an early-stage company, but it replaces a WAF, an API gateway, a developer portal, and a policy engine that would cost considerably more to build and maintain independently. Next up, let's talk about Azure API Management versus AWS API Gateway for SMBs. The comparison that comes up most often for startups evaluating Azure API Management is AWS API Gateway. Both are managed gateway services. The differences matter depending on your existing stack. Azure API Management strengths for fintech. AWS API Gateway strengths. Let's talk about next up, conclusion. Azure API Management for fintech startups is not the easiest place to start, but it is the right foundation if your product involves payment APIs, partner integrations, or plans to monetize API access. The 5 patterns here cover the baseline: OAuth 2.0 security at the gateway, rate limiting that protects both your backend and your business model, PCI DSS network and logging requirements, a tiered product model for monetization, and versioning that lets you ship changes without breaking existing consumers. Start with pattern 1 and pattern 3 before anything else. A payment API that is not secure and compliant is not a product you can sell. Once those are solid, the monetization and versioning patterns give you the infrastructure to grow into enterprise clients and partner integrations. If you are ready to design your Azure API Management architecture or need help navigating APIM setup for your specific compliance requirements, get in touch with our team for a technical consultation.